Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. I'm producer Caleb, and I'm joined by Doctors Rosenblatt, Keith, and Francisco. And today we're doing something a little different. It's not quite a full episode, but it's going to be a special drop. And today we're reflecting on 9/11 and the problem of Islam. And we happen to have, I would say, the expert in Lutheranism on Islam sitting at the table, Dr. Adam Francisco. And so we thought, who else could be more appropriate to cover this topic today? All right, Dr. Keith, you wanted to kind of slide things in here.
Yeah, I just want to say, today is the day when the country remembers 9/11. That's not really, the theme of our show so much, the left-hand kingdom kind of stuff. But at the same time, we want to acknowledge, what a meaningful day this is to a lot of people. And since we do have Adam at the table with us every week, it seemed kind of appropriate, at least, to have him, if even just for the sake of kind of getting out there what he does on this topic, because I've heard him do it. It's pretty amazing. And I talk about a little bit about what he does when he discusses the problem of Islam, but also sort of reflect on maybe how that ties into remembering 9/11 today. So, Adam, I'm kind of just going to let you loose and see what happens.
Careful there.
I know.
Well, what question should we start with?
The title of your thing is, as I've heard you do it, is the problem of Islam. Maybe we should start with why is it a problem?
Well, usually it's the challenge of Islam.
Oh, sorry.
It's a problem. People get upset.
Okay, so why is it a challenge? Well, thanks for, I don't want to upset people.
Well, let me do a little sort of autobiography, if you will. Back in, I think it was 1999 or 2000, I wrote a paper for Dr. Rosenblatt on Luther, the Protestant Reformation, the Ottoman Empire, and the Turks and Islam, and this big issue in the 16th century that oftentimes goes overlooked. And it was just a historical concern at that point. I was just curious what Luther had to say about it all. And that's 2000. I graduated from Concordia, and at some point, Dr. Rosenblatt came to me and said, you ought to think about doing graduate work in this stuff. And I said, well, I was going to seminary. I should probably do that first. But I applied anyway. And it was such an obscure topic. I thought, there's no way anybody's going to accept this. They're going to think there's not enough material on it and so on. But lo and behold, actually after September 11, 2001, I got a letter back from the University of Oxford saying, we'd love for you to come. Well, they didn't say we'd love for you.
I know.
We've accepted you. And then I got a private letter from the professor of church history there, a man named Dermot McCulloch, saying he read my essay submission, which was on Luther and the Turks, and thought it was fascinating. And then I went off. And but I remember that, I don't want to do where were you kind of stuff. That's probably quite popular today. But I do remember that day on September 11th when everything's going down. I was between the DMV and the smog station, and then I had an interview with a professor of philosophy at St. Louis University because I was thinking about maybe going there as well. But I remember when it all was going down, and I was thinking, nobody knew exactly what was going on at that point. But I remember driving down the highway in St. Louis, and there was a Muslim man with like 3 covered women just flying. He must have been going 90 to 100 miles an hour, like he was getting out of town. And then all of a sudden things started clicking. I thought, I wonder if this has anything to do with Islam. Because I remembered in studying all this stuff with Dr. Rosenblatt, the bigger historical picture, there was after the Turks failed to get Vienna in 1529 around Luther's day and age, they tried again in the fall of 1683, and they were almost successful until some Poles came down on September 11th of 1683 and turned the Turks back. So I remember thinking that day, that'd be a remarkable coincidence if this was sort of Islam again, sort of saying, hey, we're back. And since then, we found out it was Al-Qaeda, an Islamist organization, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not they chose that particular day to strike, and the verdict's still out on that. But what September 11th shows us, I think, in the big scheme of things, is that Islam, as Bernard Lewis once put it, Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations as well, Islam has always had bloody borders, historically speaking. It is a ideology. It's a civilization of a sort that has as its telos, its goal, its aim, expansion. And the creation of and I know this sounds apocalyptic and conspiratorial, but it's in their literature. It has as its goal the Islamization of everything. And the Quran's pretty clear on this. In several places it says things like, the goal is to prevail over all other things, or to fight until all dissension or rejection of Islam has ceased. So I do recognize, and I think this is just sort of sociological facts on the ground, there are lots of Muslims out there, or lots of people out there who call themselves Muslims who are nice people, but who are otherwise clueless about Islam. Islam as an ideology, as a system of thought, as a worldview, or whatever you want to call it, is highly problematic for non-Muslims. Historically, in Islamic law, there's always been this distinction between two particular realms. The domain of Islam, that's where you've got a Muslim majority population, Islamic government, and a Sharia law, Islamic law, as the law of the land. And everything outside of that is usually seen as the domain of war, into which Islam is to expand. And it wasn't so long ago, maybe a little less than 10 years ago now, that the so-called Martin Luther of Islam, Tariq Ramadan, wrote in his book, Western Muslims and the Future of Islam, that Muslims still to this day have this sort of bifurcated worldview, that outside of the domain of Islam is the domain of war, into which Muslims are to strive in jihad to influence that particular realm, or even to fight in that particular realm to cause the advance of Islam. So if that's in the tradition, it's in their so-called holy book, the Quran. In a way, it is anyway. We got a problem with Islam. It's as it once was put, the Christianity's greatest global challenge. Always has been, and probably always will be. You got any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that, I don't know if you were here for this, but on June 25th this past year, we recorded an episode where Jeff sat in. Yeah, you were here, weren't you? Where Jeff sat in when we did
Augsburg Confession.
Yeah, the Augsburg Confession. And I pointed out, and I think you backed me up, that really the Diet of Augsburg was called to, at the end of the day, primarily to address the problem of the Turks. And
that's the first paragraph of the Augsburg Confession.
Right.
I don't have it memorized, but essentially it's Philip Melanchthon saying, in order to, for this meeting, so we can establish some sort of unity, so we can deal with that most ancient and hereditary enemy of Christendom, that is the Ottoman Turks, we've drafted this confession. So you know what we believe, that we're not radicals like the Anabaptists, that we're in the greater historical Christian tradition. So, I mean, you could even thinking about the Reformation as a whole, it's not too much of a stretch. It's certainly not hyperbole for the historian to say, if it wasn't for the Ottoman Empire pushing into Central Europe in the 16th century and providing a tremendous distraction for the Pope and the Emperor, Luther may have endured the same fate as Jan Hus 100 years prior.
Right.
Yeah.
They needed... Charles V, the emperor at the time, needed German troops in northern Germany in particular to help defend Vienna. And they're largely, culturally, I guess is probably a better way of putting it, going Lutheran or going Protestant. So lots of concessions were made by the emperor and even the Pope to keep Lutheranism legitimate in exchange for troops.
Right. So it's why that's interesting to me is because right off the bat you said this has sort of been a problem for a long time, or a challenge for a long time. And I think today I can't even tell you whether I crashed those conferences or enrolled in those conferences, 5 or 6 Christian conferences this past year, and it's always a topic. And the topic is always centered around what do we do? And maybe better yet, how do we evangelize? I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess so. My follow-up question would be, it's a challenge, right? And there's sort of two sides to this. There's the political challenge, the left-hand kingdom challenge, but there's a right-hand kingdom challenge here too. Whereas Christians being generally called to proclaim the word of God to all people, this seems like this would be a particular difficult task with this population group. And what? Just for the listeners, as we sort of think about this today, what are there any clues? Are there any keys? Are there anything other than preach the gospel faithfully?
Well, I think for your average Christian, I mean, is to kind of put it real basically, is to speak the gospel to Muslims. Any chance you get it, you can. That's something that we all can do. It can be intimidating, to be sure, but it's something that, in my mind, the gospel is the only thing that can undo Islam. But in the big scheme of things, the usual sort of paradigm I work with is Islam as a historic tradition. In the left-hand kingdom, we've got to keep our eyes and ears open to all the sort of intrusions of Islam into the public arena.
Yes.
Resisting even small little things like the installation of washing or ritual ablution stations for Muslims on public campuses.
Foods that are acceptable and are not.
Right. Fremont, up in the Bay Area, they outlawed pork years ago in their public school system because there's so many Muslims there, and it offended them. These seem like small things, but for the Muslim community, they're big advances. They're victories.
Those are big wins.
Yeah. So, but it's not just that. There's national security issues. Think of the immigrant crisis, right, and refugees and immigrants. Sure, a lot of those immigrants coming over are those who would otherwise probably starve to death, or their babies would die in the Mediterranean Sea and so on. But embedded in that population will be radicals, so-called radicals. The FBI says, this is about a year ago, a year ago, they were saying there are over 100 open cases connected to the challenge or threat of ISIS here in the United States. Every American state has an issue or has a case that they're investigating. So it's huge. I think on our campus at Concordia, we have a pretty sizable Muslim population, mostly from Saudi Arabia, and thankfully, knowing a lot of those students, I'm thankful that a lot of them are kind of clueless about just what Islam really teaches. They know that they're to pray and to fast during Ramadan and the basic stuff, but they are largely clueless about what Islam requires of them in the sort of socio-political realm.
Gotcha.
Or at least that's the impression they give. At the same time, if I went to Saudi Arabia as a missionary, a Christian missionary, I'm not going to lay all my cards down. I'm going to what missionaries call contextualize things, blend in, so to speak. So I'm always, and this may be my suspicious mind, but I'm always kind of curious, what these Saudis who are coming under the guise of the so-called Saudi cultural mission, and the Arabic term for mission is dawah. And has a long lineage, and essentially it means to call people to Islam, either directly or to present things in such a way that it's attractive. So I'm always kind of wondering what the ulterior motives are of Muslim students who come to the United States to study wherever they would study. I wonder what they're really up to, apart from just getting a degree. And I am not suggesting that they're cooking up bombs in their apartment kitchen. But at the same time, I'm wondering what sort of network is being established here. And it's not necessarily a terrorist network, probably not, but some sort of network. And there's tons and tons, well, I shouldn't say tons, but there's a lot of evidence that's a matter of public record that for about 30, actually 40 years now, Muslim organizations with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, the first of the so-called radical organizations that gave birth to Al-Qaeda and other groups, there's about 24 organizations here that were created out of the Muslim Brotherhood that their minutes to their meetings say things like, we're here, for one reason and one reason only: to destroy Western civilization from within. And the way we're going to do that is through a cultural jihad.
Gosh.
We can't win the physical militant jihad. The West is much too strong. But what we can do is the war or the battle for hearts and minds, the war of ideas.
Well, you know,
I'm struck every time I hear on TV the theme that it's got to be done at the level of the ideology. And I brought this to you as a question one time. Am I crazy to think that Islam, both branches, is primarily a world-conquering thing with a veneer of religion over the top of it? And more than one Muslim scholar has said to me, no, that's not crazy to think that. Well, then I can't find anybody on TV from the West who says anything other than it's we don't know what to do to go at the ideology. And it's frustrating me because I think if just that one corner were turned, that is, it's a world-conquering philosophy / culture, and don't worry about the text of the Quran. The thing that defines it is to conquer the world. And I don't hear any of that.
Yeah, you won't hear it in the lamestream media, as it's referred to now. But there are folks out there. Sebastian Gorka is a big player who's
the Marine guy.
Yeah, he's
a professor.
Yeah, he's a consultant with. But also teaches at the Marine Corps University, I believe. He does a bit of this, and there are others who say it's the ideology we got to go after. And there are even Muslims, like we're talking, they're usually more mystically inclined Muslims, Sufi Muslims, who are doing the same thing, interestingly enough. Zuhdi Jasser, for our listeners, one thing that probably would be worth watching on YouTube is a documentary called The Third Jihad. And you can get that in, I think it's 3 segments on YouTube, and watch it. It's 2 hours long, but it's hosted by a Muslim man, American Muslim, Zuhdi Jasser, who served in the United States Navy for 20 years as I think a neurosurgeon. Was in Arizona. I don't know if he still lives there or not, but that whole documentary, he starts off by saying, we Americans know about the jihad going on when it comes to the war on terror. But you don't know about the jihad that's going on right underneath your very noses.
Yes.
And he exposes because he sees this sort of traditional politicized Islam as a tremendous problem. He thinks that the kinder, gentler form of it is the real version of it, and I think he's wrong there. But he and others like him, they're few and far between, but they are Muslims themselves who are trying to expose the insidious underbelly of Islam. Bassam Tibi, a fairly famous Middle Eastern historian and political scholar out of Europe, I think Germany now, wrote a book. His last book, he recently retired. It's called Islam and Islamism. And he said, and this is a Muslim man. And he says, what concerns me is that every group that's referred to as a moderate Muslim organization in the media by presidents, by other world leaders, these are not moderate organizations. They're what he calls Islamist organizations. That is, organizations that have this complete ideology of takeover. And his solution, the solution of a lot of these more left-leaning, if you will, or liberal kind of Muslims, is they think that the solution is for Islam to become much more mystical. You know, there's a sort of Sufi apologetic to it all. The problem is those folks who have those Muslims who are kind of allies with the West. They're few and far between, and their voice is not heard outside of the West. When they go into the Muslim world to speak, they're censored. Because they're not, as one Ayatollah put it, Ayatollah Sistani placed a prohibition on a very liberal Muslim named Abdulaziz Sajidina out of Virginia. He says, you're not allowed to teach here in Iraq. This is back in 1999, because what you're teaching isn't really Islam. But keep teaching it in the United States. So this is problematic, where things are where there is some sort of, not hope, but some interesting things going on is out of Egypt with President Sisi, who 2 years ago now, I think, stood up before Al-Azhar, which is sort of the university in the Muslim world. It's their Harvard or probably their Oxford.
Okay.
And President Sisi got up before the whole faculty and said, "We have become a cancer in the world." And he ordered the faculty to begin reforming Islam from within. Now, whether that's going to take or not, who knows? But it's a president of a major Muslim nation, Egypt being one of the sort of trendsetters in Islam. You got the president saying that the old ideology that's been with us for 1,400 years is no longer sustainable. We've got to change things. Now, the problem that's interesting, and maybe there's some people would say there's room for hope that Islam might reform, but the issue is within Muslim circles is Islam has always been resistant to any sort of innovation.
Sure.
They'll oftentimes quote a passage, not from the Quran, but another source that contains Muhammad's sayings, where Muhammad says that every innovation is a heresy, and every heresy is a sin. So there's something within Islam that resists any sort of reformation or renaissance or enlightenment within it.
Sure.
The term that's used to describe that resistance is taqlid. The book that really looks at this issue is Robert Riley's The Closing of the Muslim Mind, where he says this is what really keeps them from becoming moderate and sort of joining sort of the international scene.
So if we were to wrap up our little special episode here, you kind of touched on it a little bit, that you think that the gospel will eventually be the thing that can undo the whole thing. Is there any, like, I've had many of those Saudi students in my core theology class at the university, and I actually find them for the most part pretty, at least outwardly, as I can tell, open to hearing the gospel and to the discussion about the differences between Christianity and Islam, and willing to listen to the argument in favor of Christianity.
Yeah, some of my favorite conversations in the classroom are with these Muslim students. They will engage you, in a way that American students who are kind of asleep at the wheel won't typically.
I found that at Strasbourg. 1 year when I was teaching at the Apologetics Institute, there were 9 Muslim lawyers I had in that class, but they were willing to talk.
Yeah. This is the Muslims have what some the worldview scholars would call a pre-modern worldview, in that they believe that there's actually truth out there.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And that it's objective.
Yeah.
That if it's true and other positions contradict it, those other positions
are false. Holy cow.
And which is the same sort of, we have that sort of assumption, right?
Wow.
So you'll find that amongst conservative Christians who believe Christianity is true, and it should be contended for, and that it can be argued towards, and so on. You'll find that with Muslims, you can actually, the conversation you have with them is the conversation. It's not the frustrating conversation you have with your postmodernist.
You almost feel like you're on a bit more sure footing in that conversation.
Absolutely.
Because you can sort of argue from the same perspective.
Yeah. It's uncanny. I'm always struck whenever I'm in a conversation with a Muslim how I've had it happen several times where they say, "Adam, we've never met a Christian like you."
Yes.
And I ask, "What do you mean?" They go, "Well, the Christians we have conversation with are in these sort of interfaith gatherings, right? Where it's the super liberal clergy person from the local United Church of Christ or what have you, who basically sells the whole farm to Islam for a penny.
Right.
And then they encounter a confessing Christian in the historic Christian tradition. And they've heard about such people, but they thought they're a thing of the past, Like, there's still some people like you around.
Yes.
And like in the realm of ethics, none of us are ethical people here. We're aethical, right? We're not really, I'm kidding. We're not really interested in.
It's not our center.
Yeah. It's, but if you value family, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, these sorts of things, they've never met people like they have not met many people like that.
Yes.
That hold to kind of conservative traditional values.
Yeah.
I've had that happen to me time and again, where a Muslim expresses amazement that not only are you a throwback of a Christian from the past,
Yes.
but you actually have a tremendous amount of respect for the things that they have a tremendous amount of respect for in the left-hand kingdom: family,
Yep.
life,
Yep.
Freedom,
Yep.
and so on. Freedom in a qualified sense. for
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but-
Yeah.
All right. So long story short, have the conversation. Right. Our
the same-
listeners might
yeah,
find
yeah.
themselves on,
Yeah.
at least on some points, truth being one of them,
Yeah.
attainable truth, understandable truth.
Now, there isn't a long history, is there, Adam, of Muslim apologetics to Christians? Not
No.
really.
I mean,
They're doing it now, but they're doing it as a reaction to what Christians
yes.
are doing.
So
But it doesn't have a long, thick history, does it?
it depends. Even the biography of Muhammad that was written about 200 years after he died, the earliest one we have, has apologetic elements to it. And historians think that the reason why there are miracles attributed to Muhammad in the biography, the reason why Christianity is focused on, and especially the charge that Christians have corrupted the scriptures, they believe that those were written into the biography because Muslims were at that time finally engaging Christians.
Uh-huh.
So you do find a long apologetic tradition in Islam. My supervisor at Oxford, the Muslim scholar, said that there is no theology in Islam the way you Westerners think of theology, constructing systems that
Right.
are coherent and so on.
Right.
If there is a theology, it's inherently apologetic, he said. That is, it's a theology that tries to promote the rationale of Islam.
Okay.
And on the negative side, the polemical side, tries to deconstruct, if you will, other positions.
Okay.
But that tradition is pretty. It's sort of a monologue. It's Muslims talking amongst themselves. So if they have an apologetic, it's this tremendously circular apologetic in favor of Islam, and very much a negative apologetic towards other traditions, in that they assume Islam's true.
There's a lesson for Christians.
Right. That sounds like
presuppositionalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a little
I probably
bit.
shouldn't go further, but they have that. You finally start to see Muslims becoming more evidential in their apologetic. In actually, Christine Schumacher out of Germany is the first to actually explore this. In India, when the British have colonized India, the Anglican missionaries there actually start to insist. I wanted to say force. I don't know if force is the right term, but they would force Muslim scholars into a large public debate.
Uh-huh.
And Muslim scholars got their clocks cleaned right away. So what do? They go and start doing their homework, and they start looking at German higher criticism
Aha.
and use that and kind of turn the tables
Yep.
on these Christian Anglican
Probably
missionary
Ehrman.
apologists.
Probably Ehrman is of great use to the Muslim.
Well, this is
apologist.
where it is today. Muslim apologetics have gotten pretty sophisticated in a general sense of the term, in that they will argue much more sophisticated historical, factual way against Christianity,
Yep.
using Bart Ehrman,
Yep.
who's sort of like the modern
Yep.
face of
There's a lesson there too.
Yeah, that's right.
higher criticism masquerading as text criticism.
Yeah, before all this took place, I remember that Dr. Montgomery published in the Muslim World
Yes.
one called Muhammad Ali and his
Yes.
apologetic for Islam.
That's an outstanding essay describing how Muslims traditionally approach apologetics. It's great, required reading if you're going to get into this sort of thing. And that's still the common way they approach things, though they're moving beyond that now. In the last 15 years or so, they've
Okay.
moved towards a more evidential approach. So,
Wild.
yeah.
All right. Well, Adam, thanks for doing what you do. That was quite informing. In half an hour, you
Was it half an hour?
changed my
Do
world.
you want to go for a couple more hours? This is my wheelhouse.
That is your.
Nobody ever wants to talk about it with me.
I feel that way about Melanchthon. So I know what you're talking about. I start to talk in people's eyes, just kind of get a little
Glaze
glaze
over,
that
yeah.
goes over them. Okay. Thanks very much. Today, obviously, we remember and pray for the families of the victims of 9/11 and for all those people who responded. And we ask that the Lord be with them and keep them until He comes again.
All right. Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Thinking Fellows.